I've directed my team to move heaven and earth to reopen the port and rebuild the bridge as soon as humanly possible. We're going to work with our partners in Congress to make sure the state gets the support it needs. It's my intention that the federal government will pay for the entire cost of reconstructing that bridge, and I expect the Congress to support my effort.
Within hours of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsing after the cargo ship crash, President Joe Biden pledged the federal government would take the lead on rebuilding it. The bridge is crucial not just for the state of Maryland or the port of Baltimore, but for the entire economy of the eastern seaboard. The bridge collapse was a disaster, and one core role of the federal government is to backstop after disasters. At least one Republican is already balking at the idea of using federal funds to rebuild this important piece of infrastructure.
Is Congress going to need to pony up more money, or is there enough money in the infrastructure package?
Yeah, great to be with you, Maria. Yeah, it was kind of outrageous immediately for Biden to express in this tragedy the idea that he's going to use federal funds to pay for the in entirety.
It's become standard for a certain type of Republican, unfortunately, like podcaster Ted Cruz, voting against emergency relief after Superstorm Sandy, only to come hat in hand to claim federal money for Texas after Hurricane Harvey. Even ran an ad about how much money he got. And again for the power grid disaster. And in 2020, during the height of the COVID emergency, Donald Trump boasted about not providing support to governors who didn't support him. Now, with this enormous disaster in Baltimore, we're once again seeing the MAGA vision of governance in action, which is you only get government services if you support Donald Trump, and screw you if you don't. Joining me now, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you on the program. First, I wanted to get a kind of brief from you on where things stand in the aftermath of this disaster in terms of knowing what caused it and what the next few steps look like.
Thanks. Well, the NTSB is leading the investigation in partnership with the Coast Guard and a number of agencies that are involved. They're going through the black box, looking at everything that could be relevant to understanding the causes. They work independently from us by design, but we're doing everything we can to help in their effort. In the meantime, our focus really is, as a department, is making sure we prepare for what's next. That means getting that bridge rebuilt and dealing with all of the traffic disruptions until it is, getting the port reopened, and dealing with all of the supply chain disruptions until that happens. Right now, there are 3 heavy lift vessels on their way to the site that should begin arriving tomorrow, and the last of them should be in place a couple of days after that. To begin with that process of getting the wreckage cleared, you got to understand that passage that is blocked by the ship and the bridge there, that is the only channel in to most of the port of Baltimore, which is, of course, a very important port for the East Coast. So that's why we've got to make sure that we get that cleared in a safe and responsible way so that the port can get back up and running. Then there's the longer-term effort of making sure the bridge can get back up. Just hours ago, we released the first $60 million of federal funding to help with that through our emergency relief program. There's, I'm sure, going to be much more where that came from. Everything it takes, as the president said, to help everyone in Baltimore get back to normal.
So clearing that ship, which is still in that channel, that's the channel that creates passage in and out of the port to get the port active again. That's sort of priority number one right now. The $60 million in quick release emergency relief funds that got announced, I guess there's a sort of pot of money for the immediate aftermath of disasters. And then in terms of the actual transportation logistics here, I mean, it strikes me as an enormous problem, right, to not have that bridge in terms of hazardous materials, in terms of flow from the port as well. Do you have a game plan for how to deal with that?
Yeah, we've been working side by side with the Maryland DOT under the leadership of Governor Wes Moore as they have been putting together their plans to do the design and the procurement for the new bridge and everything it takes to get that port back up and running. As you noted, this is an important thoroughfare, about 30,000 vehicles a day counted on that bridge. There are alternatives, 95 and 895, but those are both tunnels, which are not suitable for hazardous material transportation, at least most of the time. Part of what makes this complicated in the meantime. But these are some of the things that that the funds can help with, and certainly in terms of clearing that channel. These funds can go to demolition, debris removal. They can go to supporting some of the costs associated with detours, as well as the early spending on that design and procurement of a new bridge. And believe it or not, even though the original bridge took 5 years to construct, they have already had meetings and sessions beginning yesterday to launch the procurement and design process to get it back up.
Okay, so that was my next question. I mean, just looking at that bridge, that looks like an expensive, difficult to build bridge. I know nothing about bridges, but just my amateur eye, it's a long expanse. It also has to be built so that ships can pass in and out underneath it. This is a non-trivial undertaking. What's the timeline and the cost like? And are you worried at all from the words we heard from the Republican congressman today that this House Republican majority is not going to be interested in providing the funding?
This really needs to be a bipartisan priority, and anybody who views it as otherwise, I'm hoping they will reconsider, because it could be your district that is the next one to be struck by tragedy, and we always do better when America comes together. Let me give you one example of a situation that happened in the past. In 2007, many were killed and injured when I-35 bridge collapsed in Minnesota. That was not because of a ship strike or a truck strike. In that case, it wasn't going over the bay the way the bridge in Baltimore is. But what it had in common was a sudden and catastrophic collapse. In the end, about $260 million of federal funds were brought together. And that is something that really passed very quickly and rather easily in that Congress. I would like to believe we can get that done now, too. To be clear, things like the $60 million we put forward today, we've already got that funding because it was authorized in President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure plan that passed back in 2021. But it's certainly the case that more funding might be needed. And again, this really shouldn't be partisan in the least. Getting just like the original bipartisan infrastructure law was bipartisan. We didn't have all Republicans with us, of course, but a number of Republicans crossed the aisle to work with President Biden, work with Democrats, and get that done, because there's nothing partisan about a road or a bridge.
Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you so much for your time tonight. Appreciate it, sir. I'm joined now by Rachel Maddow, host of The Rachel Maddow Show, airing Mondays right here on MSNBC. Rachel, I, of course, thought of you when I saw the Segretti shout-out in the Eastman decision as a huge Watergate nerd and obsessive. But the other thing that always makes me chuckle morbidly when I go back there is, like, those people, a bunch of them went to prison. Like, they didn't just, get disbarred. There were also criminal consequences for a number of them.
Yeah, and thank you for pointing that out and putting it right next to the way in which the Segretti case was name-checked in the John Eastman disbarment recommendation. As you pointed out, the way Segretti was brought up was, oh, and by the way, what John Eastman did is way worse than what Donald Segretti did. And Donald Segretti, of course, went to prison. I mean, John Eastman may yet go to prison. I mean, it is to see Trump lawyers here. We've got Giuliani with his license suspended. I still don't really understand what happened to the criminal or the federal investigation of Rudy Giuliani and how that exactly went away. There's still unanswered questions there. He's not currently a defendant anywhere. He is facing a ruinous defamation judgment, and his law license is suspended. We've got Eastman now with the recommendation that he be disbarred. He's barred from practicing law, suspended right now. Ken Chesebro, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis have all pled guilty. We've got all of them, right? Stephanie Lambert in Michigan just got arrested last week. There's one of the takeaways from this is that the bar associations are holding up as an American institution. And who would have picked them as the institution that was going to be really important here? But they tried to construct a sort of legal tissue around this coup effort, this violent coup effort to take over the government. And the lawyers thus far have really been the only ones that have paid. It's been the rioters and the lawyers. And the reason the lawyers have paid is because the bar associations have stood up as an institution and said, we're going to do our part here.
That's such an important point, because part of what was so insidious about the coup attempt, particularly as channeled through Chesebro and Eastman and sort of less so Powell, honestly, who was sort of doing PR more than actual law, was that there were what they said were colorable legal claims. Jeffrey Clark as well, right? That like they were trying to cloak all of this in the language not of open insurrection against the United States of America, not an attempt to topple democracy, which is what they were trying to do, but in a bunch of sort of procedural mechanics about how the Electoral Count Act works and all this. And so in that respect, it does strike me as very important. The Bar Association, the Guild of Lawyers, is actually saying these arguments aren't just like arguments at the margin that are sort of interesting. They're actually not doing law. They're doing something else that violates the kind of ethical duty you have as a lawyer.
Yes. And I mean, people who study the way that democracies turn into authoritarian systems of government talk about civil society and talk about professional associations and talk about the different types of institutions that we have as a country that you don't necessarily think of as being close to like the electoral process and the other things that we think of as politics, but they end up having a really important role in policing essentially what you're allowed to do and stay in good standing. So like when we've talked about, or when I've been obsessed with the American fascist and would-be fascist leaders in the 1930s, the Catholic Church ended up being really, really important. You know, they did a lot of bad things in the lead up to World War II and during World War II, but they also took Charles Coughlin off the air when Coughlin was organizing his listeners in America into paramilitary cells and telling them to prepare for violent revolution against the U.S. government. It was the church that came in and took him off the air. With George Van Horn Mosley, who was born storming the country saying he was going to be the American Fuhrer. He'd been deputy chief of staff of the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army came in and said, we're going to take your pension if you keep talking about being if you keep talking about being America's Fuhrer. And he decided he'd keep the money and ditch the dictatorship. Institutions of all different kinds are called upon in different ways to do this. And the bar associations, there's been a concerted effort within the legal profession to say not in our name and not with our skills and not with our profession. We self-regulate as a profession and we're not going to do this.
So there's another aspect to this too. So there's the institutional aspect and civil society sort of holding up in the bar association, which is really important to me. But last night we talked about Kari Lake and the fact that she's basically waved the white flag on a defamation suit filed against her for the lies she told about her own loss in 2022, a kind of like, Big Lie 2, like her own sort of knockoff sequel that was as ridiculous and luckily not as violent. What strikes me as important, and I want to say this because I think people think like, oh, the libs want Donald Trump to be tried for this sort of retribution, or I honestly, the thing that is most important to me is like the epistemic aspect, which is we don't in this country have a lot of mechanisms to focus people on establishing consensus facts. And I think the January 6th committee did that to some point, but it was tarnished in lots of ways. And what's striking is whether it's in the defamation cases, the many we've seen, or in these other adjudicative processes like state bars, when you get into that realm, there is nothing there. The facts are plain as day. The intentions are plain as day. And to fix that for the American people, that's why I feel it's so important. Not even about retribution or justice or accountability. It's actually just establishing what happened. Yes. And part of it, I mean, because, part of me is forever 8 years old and constantly needs to be entertained. Part of it is just the hilarity of it, right? In the Jeff Clark disbarment trial, one of the things that we learned from a senior Justice Department official who just testified in that trial is that Jeff Clark's belief about what was going on with the election was tied to his fantasy that smart thermostats had stolen the election. Like, okay, I want to know more about that. Like, please give me all of that. I want to hear it. But the more serious point is that you're exactly right, Chris. I mean, the criminal justice system, for all its faults, it makes evidence public. Right. It tests evidence. Yes. It tests facts. It's an adversarial, fair process. And when you lie, your lie is exposed, and then that is inadmissible or it is punished. And pouting doesn't count, and yelling doesn't count, and threats are illegal, and it's a compulsory process, and the truth gets proven, and it's done in a fair way that everybody can see. You get to put your best foot forward. You get to make your best case with joke lawyers or with real lawyers if you can afford them. And that process is something that
can prove reality. It can bring Earth 1 and Earth 2 crashing together in a way that really makes all the myth lose its power. If it doesn't make it disappear, but it exposes it in a way that is unimpeachable.
And we've seen small versions of that time and time and time again in all these different areas, but not the big one yet. Rachel Maddow, what a pleasure to have you this evening. Thank you very much.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.